So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just a quick note: we're gonna record a copy for those that couldn't make it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Will Gilbert. I'm one of the co-founders of Socium. We're a technology and transformation staffing business. Obviously, as you know, joined by Matt Tyler from Larsen, Howie. So Matt runs their IR35 practice. We've all heard a lot of noise about IR35, but what we wanted to do today was take the opportunity to explain what the proposed reforms mean to organisations that have an externally engaged workforce, and of course the contractors and interims that make up that population. I think from Socium's perspective, we've seen a bit of a shift in the industry over the last few months since people have been talking about it more and more. And indeed, we've shifted our business model to be more of a hybrid consultancy where teams are engaged on a pre-form manner against a statement of work, clear milestones, and all of that good stuff to move the risk arrow for clients away from them, because that sort of thing is typically not within scope. But we do work with a lot of clients on a more contingent manner. We've seen a mixed response from them so far in their approach to IR35, with everything from doing absolutely nothing about it, which a lot of people are in that camp. So if that's you, don't be too alarmed. There's plenty of others out there. To others that have moved to our new service model of having everybody on statement of work engagement, and everything in between. So I guess really that's probably enough of me prattling on. So I will hand over to Matt.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Will. So as Will says, essentially the idea behind this webinar is we're just going to talk through what IR35 is, where it came from, what the key status tests are, and essentially what the changes that are going to be happening in the private sector going forward in 2020. There is going to be a period at the end of the presentation for questions or queries that you might have. So when you're going through, if you just raise the questions, we'll get to them when we get to the end. Okay? Excellent. Good stuff. So as mentioned, the idea behind this presentation is that we just go through essentially all of the key status tests in relation to IR35 and what you should be looking out for the, if you're a contractor, what you need to be looking out for in your contract. And if you're, say, an accountant or an agency, the sorts of things that you need to be keeping an eye on as well with your engagements with the clients. Okay. So what is IR35? Well, in a nutshell, IR35 is a piece of legislation that was introduced by HMRC in 2000. Try and counteract what they saw as being the rising threat of people who were essentially operating as employees but via a limited company. So people were more or less leaving their job on the Friday and coming back on the Monday, doing exactly the same work as if they were an employee, but just via their limited company instead, or a limited company instead. This naturally had quite a few tax advantages, and because, as I'm sure you're all aware, a contractor does actually pay less tax because they split their income by way of dividends rather than just PAYE. HMRC didn't like that at all. They saw it as people abusing the system, so they introduced IR35 to stop that happening. The result of that, unfortunately, is that people who legitimately are trying to operate as a contractor end up getting caught by IR35. So that is in essence what IR35 was brought in to try and counteract. It's met with varied success, shall we say. Arguably, HMRC has been a little bit ham-fisted with their approach on it, and they're not terrifically good at enforcing it themselves. But HMRC's argument with IR35 has always been that the threat of being inside of IR35 produces a lot of hypothetical tax gains for the government as a whole, as opposed to the actual amount of income they've generated off of it, which I don't have the exact figures for it, but I do know it's not a terrifically large amount in concert with the amount they've spent trying to actually enforce it. So when does IR35 apply? by and large, what you see in front of you here, the 3 or 4 minor bullet points there, are the official rulings for when IR35 can apply to an engagement. So a worker or their family controls more than 5% of the ordinary share capital in their company, or a worker or their family are entitled to receive more than 5% of any dividends from the company, or, and this last one boiled down in a nutshell, is the worker receives or could receive payments in another form, for example, loans from the company. What it essentially all boils down into is if the contractor is a UK-based limited company paying UK-based taxes, then there is a very good chance that they are going to get caught by IR35 or could be caught by IR35, depending on the key status tests that we're moving into a little bit later on. When you're doing an IR35 review of a contractor, you need to consider both the written terms the contractor is working under, if there are any, because it's not a legal requirement to carry contracts, and the working practices of the contractor. So the reality of how they're engaging versus what the written terms state. They're not always one and the same. So it's very important you look at both aspects. Some clients I've spoken to out there look at purely just the written terms and say, yeah, they're outside of IR35 based on that. It's not really sufficient. So you need to make sure you're looking at both the written terms and the working practices of the contractor. So case law is essentially what has established IR35 in the past in terms of how it's determined. What you see in front of you there, the ready-mix concrete case, is the probably the biggest case around status for IR35. It was established in 1968, so very, very old piece of legislation, but it is still very relevant and very important today. Didn't mean to do that. Let's go back. There are a whole slew of other pieces of case law out there. Gentle Software versus HMRC, for example, Dragonfly Consultancy versus HMRC, a whole bunch more. Gentle Software itself was actually defended by the gentleman who heads up the tax side of things here at Larsen, Howie, Andy Vesey. So I would encourage you to have a look at both ready-mix concrete, especially, and a couple of other bits of case law if you're at all interested in it. I will warn you that it's a little bit of a dry topic, so make sure you have plenty of coffee with you when you're going through the case law. So the key status tests and the minor status tests. What we look for when we're dealing with IR35 are the key status tests, first and foremost, which are a lack of personal service requirement, the levels of control the contractors are subject to, and whether or not there's any intended mutuality of obligation. Those really are the, to borrow Andy's phrasing, the holy trinity of tax status for IR35. They were all established as part of the ready-mix concrete case law, but they are found throughout pretty much every other bit of case law around IR35 in one form or another. Alongside of that is a whole range of minor status tests, which I'll be running through in just a few minutes. It's key to note that there are more minor status tests than what are shown in the presentation, but the ones in the presentation would be the most salient ones, the most important ones. So when considering IR35, you have to weigh up all of the factors in the contractor's engagement. The key status tests are going to be the most important aspects, but if in the event of uncertainty or if everything's in balance, then at that point, the minor status tests become much more important. They are, if you like, the balancing factor, the tipping point in the event of doubt or uncertainty, which is why it's very important you make sure that absolutely everything is rock solid, because you never know when it's going to be the minor status tests that you rely on to determine status. So the key status tests, starting off with probably, or in my eyes, the most important piece of status test, the most important status test for contractors, which is the ability to supply a substitute, or I suppose more accurately, the lack of personal service requirement. So when you're dealing with a lack of personal service requirement, it is, first and foremost, very important for me to note that it's not just substitution that comes into this. When you're dealing with a lack of personal service, you also have factors such as subcontracting, or even assignment of the contract, or engaging helpers even to help you on your way to becoming compliant from a personal service point of view. It is fair to say that perhaps assignment isn't as good an indicator as the others, but subcontracting definitely will help your case, as will help engaging helpers. The absolute best thing that a contractor can do to demonstrate a lack of personal service requirement, however, is engaging a substitute. So when we're dealing with engaging a substitute, what we're referring to there is the contractor replacing themselves entirely in the engagement for a period of time with another individual who is suitably skilled, qualified, and experienced to do the work. In essence, the example I always give to the contractors I speak to is if you liken it to engaging a plumber to fix a toilet in your home. You're not bothered whether or not it's Mario or Luigi, the plumber, that comes to do the work. You're just interested that it's a fully skilled and qualified plumber, and that they can essentially complete the work to your satisfaction. The same should apply to pretty much every contractor out there. If you ever get a contractor to turn around and tell you that they can't supply a substitute because they're the only person in their limited company, HMRC don't really see that as being a legitimate reason as to why you can't provide a substitute. The reason there being is the contractor could well, they could well just engage like an agency to find somebody to contract for them. They could engage a friend, for example, for a short period of time via their own limited company, that sort of thing. There is all sorts of ways a contractor can engage a substitute that doesn't have to be an employee of their own company. So another key thing to note with the right of substitution is that it's the hypothetical right of substitution that is important, not actually exercising the right of substitution. Whilst actually exercising the right of substitution is probably the best thing a contractor can do to demonstrate their status, HMRC themselves has said that the hypothetical right of substitution is sufficient, which is to say, if the contractor had somebody, could the contractor send them, and would the client accept that individual? So again, it's not asking, do you have somebody available? It's saying, if you did, could you send them? Yeah. With that, it's important to note that the client does have a right to veto substitution. It's not a case that, the contractor can send anybody they want to do the work. It's a case that the contractor can send a suitably skilled and qualified individual to do the work. So if, for example, a high-flying IT contractor tried to send myself to do their job, it'd be perfectly reasonable for the client to turn around and say that they're not accepting me because I wouldn't know how to do the contractor's work. But if the contractor would supply somebody who could do the work as well as they could, if not better, then there, once again, is no legitimate reason as to why the contractor should be refused on that situation. With that, the easiest way of sort of considering that is to actually ask it from the outset. So if you're a contractor, make sure you're asking it to the client, not the agency, the client. And if you're an agency yourself, it should once again be asked to the client themselves, just to make sure that they are happy with the suitably skilled and qualified individual being sent in the contractor's place, should the need arise. So I've included in the presentation, and you'll see this in a few other places, a couple of example clauses that you might see in a written set of terms that tries to cover off a couple of these points. In front of you at the moment, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you'll all get a copy of the presentation slides afterwards, is an example of a positive substitution clause. I'd suggest that you keep an eye out for this and the other example clauses, as it gives you a good example of what you're looking for when you're reviewing your contracts, even if you're only giving them a cursory look. So that's a positive one there. And we've got a negative one on the next page right here. So again, not going to spend too much time on that. So next up, we have the right of control. The right of control is some would argue probably more important than substitution. The shifting nature of IR35 seems to be slightly heading that way, but for the time being, substitution and control are sort of vying for first place, would probably be the way that I would put it. So when you're dealing with control, there are 4 tests or 4 sub-tests to look at, which is what the work is, where the work needs to be done, when the work is done, and how the work is done. You need to look at all of them to get a sort of holistic approach to IR35 to be able to determine whether or not there is going to be a level of control over the contractor. It is key to note as well that when you're dealing with the right of control, it's not just whether or not there is actually control exercised over the contractor, it's whether or not the client has the ability to exercise control. So what I mean by that is if the client never actually exercises a right of control over the contractor, say, for example, in telling them how to do the work, but the contractor always knew that they had the right to tell the contractor how to do the work, that is going to be probably, in HMRC's eyes, sufficient proof that the contractor is operating under the control or could be operating under the control of the client. So it's very important that you're very clear on levels of control the contractor is subject to. So the first of the tests, what the work is. So it's perfectly reasonable for the client to outline what the work is going to be to the contractor. So I need you to develop this website. These are the specifications for it. This is when I need it to be completed by. Fine, you know, that's just nature of the work. A contractor needs to know what the work is that they're going to be undertaking. The issue you have is when it starts stepping beyond that and the contractor is being micromanaged by the client. So they don't just tell them what the overarching project requirements are, but they tell them exactly how to do the work. Again, if we use the plumber example, the contractor or the plumber is told, my toilet's broke, fix it. You then leave the plumber to get on with the work, and you don't tell them how to do the work. You know, you don't say, don't put the pipe here, it goes here, don't use that tool, use this one. They're the expert at the end of the day. So it's up to them how to conduct the work. If you're giving constant instructions to the contractor, then it's going to be seen as a form of control. If you're moving the contractor from task to task without getting the contractor's consent or agreement, that's going to be seen as a form of control. Me as an employee of Larsen Howie, for example, if the work dried up and there wasn't really anything IR35 related that needed to be done, my boss would be well within his rights to turn around and say, Matt, you've got experience in dealing with sales, move over to the sales line. And I would just kind of have to comply with that. Whereas a contractor, if there was, say, for example, if it was something they could do, say, for example, it was a web developer and the client wanted a new web page developing, but it wasn't in their initial remit, then the client should be approaching the contractor and asking them if it's something they want to take up. And if so, renegotiating terms on that basis. It should not just be thrust upon the contractor. So as before, you have an example of a positive control clause in the slide in front of you there. So that's essentially what you'd be looking for when you're reviewing or looking at your contracts or your client's contracts. The next one up, which is not quite as important because there's generally a good reason for it, is where the work is done. So the location that the work is done is a factor in dealing with IR35, or more specifically the levels of control, because ideally the contractor should have the ability to provide services from a location of their own choice. If there is a legitimate reason why the contractor cannot choose the location of their services, then that's going to be fine for IR35 purposes. So what I mean by that is if, for example, the contractor was engaged to work on a server with secure data on it, it's perfectly reasonable that the client's not really going to be able to, the contractor is not really going to be able to do that from a home location, because they need access to that secure server that's located on the client's site. So in that situation, it's perfectly reasonable for the client to have to work from the client's office. If, however, the contractor's work was something they could do from home, say, for example, developing an app, then there's no good reason why the contractor shouldn't be able to choose the location of their services. So that's usually why it's considered to be fairly neutral, because there is a good reason most of the time, usually data protection, as to why a contractor has to work from the office. It is important to note as well, another factor that comes into that is the fact that employees are able to work from home as well. So ultimately, just being able to work from a home office isn't necessarily indicative of being outside of IR35, although it is a helping point. So when, in a similar nature to the location of the services, this is considered to be quite a minor pointer when you're dealing with control, because once again, there is usually good reasons as to why a contractor has to work specific hours. That being said, there should always be a degree of flexibility with the contractor's work. So, for example, if a contractor is told that they need to work 9 till 5 Monday to Friday with an hour's lunch break, that's far much too indicative of employment. If, however, a contractor was told, say, 40 hours a week or 5 days a week, not together but separately, so either 40 hours a week or 5 days a week, then that's going to be a positive for IR35 purposes, because the contractor is not being told when they need to allocate those hours or those days. They're just being told this is what we budgeted for, in essence. So the contractor could, for example, spend 12 hours working on a Monday, 3 hours on the Tuesday, 13 hours on the Wednesday, and just make up the rest of the time of the rest of the week. Ultimately, the client's not bothered so long as 40 hours are met in every week. Same with the working days. It's up to the contractor as to whether or not they want to work Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday for their 5 days, or whether or not they just want to do a standard working week. Ultimately, it's at the client's discretion, the contractor's discretion in that case. The ideal that you're looking for when you're dealing with control, and more specifically when the work is done, is that the contractor has complete discretion over the hours the services are performed. So in the contract, you might see something along the lines of the contractor shall perform services. So the contractors will perform services at whatever hours the contractor deems necessary for successful completion of the services. Might be an example of a set of wording you'd see in a contract that would support the contractor's ability to level the hours that they're providing services. Once again, there are usually legitimate reasons as to why the contractor can't work those hours, such as they need to liaise with client staff who are only available between 9 till 5, and it's an important aspect of their work that they do liaise with those individuals, so they have to be available during those set hours. The important thing to bear in mind there is they're not specifically restricted to those hours. It's just by the nature of their services, they're the only hours that are reasonable. So there's an example of some positive clauses for when the work is done. You might see those lurking around the contract in some situations. They're not always there, but they should really be there if they can be. Finally, how the work is done. Now, I did touch upon this a little bit earlier on in respects to the contractor being the expert in their services. So ultimately, it should be up to them how to define and do the work that's been allocated to them. HMRC don't usually put a lot of stock in this test for the pure reason that they say that all contractors are highly skilled and all contractors decide how they do the work, so it doesn't really count for much, but it can't really be discredited. It's an important factor that the contractor is not told how to do the work and that they are just told essentially what the work is. So with this, something that often comes up is working in a team. Just working in a team is not necessarily indicative of being an employee. It's just the nature of work these days that most people will work in a team rather than by themselves. A bigger factor in determining whether or not a contractor is controlled is whether or not they have a manager. Now, I'm not talking about like a project manager in this situation. I'm talking about an actual line manager, someone who approves holiday, or does disciplinaries or appraisals, that sort of thing. That's not something a contractor should ever be subject to. And if they are, that will cause problems from an IR35 perspective. If they're just working as part of a team and they have a project manager who, say, for example, allocates certain tasks out in the engagement, as long as those tasks are always known about and it's not coming as a surprise to the contractor, that will probably be acceptable from an IR35 perspective. So once again, a couple of example clauses there for how the work is done. But we're finally on to mutuality of obligation. Now, HMRC really likes to pretend that this test doesn't exist, which is very short-minded, shall we say, of HMRC. They should not imagine that this test doesn't exist. HMRC's general take on it is if the contractor has accepted an offer of work and they're getting paid for that work, then mutuality of obligation exists. Not the case at all. That is essentially what is referred to in case law as the irreducible basic, or the irreducible minimum, to be more precise. It's essentially the offer and acceptance of an engagement is the absolute basic mutuality of obligations that you would expect to see in an engagement. Anything above that is when you start having an issue. So in a nutshell, the way I normally describe this to people is that there should be no expectation of work to be offered or accepted by either the contractor or the client or agency. Essentially, the contractor is there to do a specific piece of work, and once that work is done, the contractor should go on their way. To use the plumber example again, once the plumber's finished fixing your toilet, he then doesn't hang around and say, so what's next? Do you want me to fix your shower? Do you want me to sort your plumbing work out and do you need your sink or anything like that? He's there, he's done the job, he gets paid, he goes. Simple as that. Same thing, once again, should apply to pretty much any contractor. It is key to note with mutuality of obligation specifically that it's not just whether or not there's any work offered or accepted after the engagement. So expectation of a rolling ongoing contract, for example. It's also whether or not there's any expectation of work to be offered during the engagement. So what I mean by that is if work dried up on the contractor's contract, the engagement they're working under, there should be essentially the expectation the client will just say to the contractor, you're not needed anymore. Thanks for the work so far. We'll pay you up to date, but that's it. Bye. They shouldn't say to them, oh, don't worry about it. We'll find you something to do. Yeah, we'll find you extra work, that sort of thing. If the contractor's project has stopped, the contractor should also stop. Simple as that. So once again, a couple of example mutuality obligation clauses you can see there. These tend to be located in every contract. I've yet to see a contract that doesn't have some form of this, but it is very important to note that as with all of the other clauses, it needs to be reflected in reality. Simply having it in the contract is not sufficient for IR35 purposes. It will help, absolutely, but if it's not reflected in reality, then HMRC will not put much, if any, stock in it at all. So we're on to the minor status tests. I will try to whiz through these because there are quite a number of them. First and foremost, probably the most important of the minor status tests is financial risk. I personally almost classify financial risk as being one of the key status tests. It's not, but it is very, very important. So what we mean by financial risk is, in essence, anything that is bad financially for the contractor will be good for a financial risk perspective and dealing with IR35. So being required to correct defective work. So if the contractor makes a mock-up of the work they're doing and they need to reperform any portion of it, then that will be a positive indicator for financial risk. An employee, for example, me, if I make a mistake at Larsen Howie, then I might get my wrists slapped by my boss, but I wouldn't be expected to correct the defective work, or at least if I do have to correct it, then I'd still get paid for the time spent I undertake that correction. A contractor, however, wouldn't. Once again, to bring it back to that plumber example, if the contractor turned around and said to you, yep, I fixed your toilet, and then you flush it and it springs a leak and water goes everywhere, you would say to the contractor, no, you haven't, fix it, get back on it. And then you would expect the contractor to do that at their own time and their own expense. You wouldn't expect to have to pay them for the time they spend correcting their own mistake. Another example of financial risk would be around a contractor having to carry their own business insurances. Once again, an employee never has to carry their business insurances, has to purchase business insurances, I should say, because their employer will usually have the insurances they need, whereas a contractor should have to buy their own insurances. If they don't, then that can be an indicator that they are not, in fact, not operating a genuine business. So two factor there. One is the actual purchasing of the insurances and potentially having to rely on them counts as financial risk. The other aspect of business insurances and why they're usually seen as being quite important is the fact that it will help demonstrate the contractor is operating a genuine business. So yeah, financial risk is a very, very important test, and I normally explain it to contractors by just saying to them that anything that's bad for them personally is usually bad from good from an IR35 perspective, as perverse as that sounds. So you'll usually see in the contract a financial risk clause about them having to correct defective work. To be honest with you, in the probably thousands of contracts I've reviewed now, I've yet to see a contract that doesn't have some form of financial risk in there, but it is important that it is demonstrated. So you'll usually either see an insurance clause or a financial risk clause such as this, where they have to correct defective work. Most of the time, an end client is all too happy to include more financial risk for the contractor in the engagement. So there shouldn't really be any issue getting something added to the contract or the engagement to help support that fact. Oh, I don't know what that's just done there. So provision of equipment. This one can be quite a strong indicator for whether or not a contract is considered to be outside of IR35. It is largely dependent on the level of equipment that's used. So if, for example, a contractor was supplying their own laptop and a mobile phone, that probably won't be considered to be a high level purchase or equipment being supplied to the engagement. A laptop would generally be considered to be a everyday item by HMRC. If, however, the contractor was purchasing highly specialized equipment or something that was used up in the provision of the services, that will carry a lot more weight from an IR35 perspective. For example, an IT contractor could buy a highly specialized bit of software, a particular bit of hardware that might help them with the work they're doing. And if the cost is fairly substantial, and HMRC unfortunately don't really give much guidance on what is considered to be substantial or not, then HMRC will put more stock in that and consider it to be appointed towards a contractor being outside of IR35. Another example would be, for example, a bricklayer providing bricks to build an extension to their house. The bricks would be used up in the provision of the services, so the actual building of the house, etc., would use up the bricks. And once the work is completed, the contractor would not then take those bricks away. So they are investing money into the services that they're not going to get back or be able to reuse elsewhere. That's also partially why a laptop isn't considered to be a substantial investment for the provision of equipment pointer, because ultimately the laptop can be reused time and time again on every engagement. It is important to note that a lot of the time as well, as another sort of impactor for provision of equipment, that there is legitimate reasons as to why a contractor can't use their own equipment. A classic one is data protection. At the end of the day, the client's not going to want the contractor just plugging any old laptop into their system, because it could introduce all sorts of problems to the client's network. So it's a perfectly reasonable restriction for the client to say to the contractor, look, you're going to have to use our equipment. We don't want anything introduced into the system that's not already there. So again, if there is a good reason as to why the contractor can't use their own equipment, it will usually be defendable from an IR35 perspective. And there's an example of the clause that would be located in a contract to support the fact that the contractor should supply their own equipment. Basis of payment. This is kind of twofold. A contractor should always be providing their services and billing for those services by way of an invoice to the client. If they don't, then it can be an indicator towards them being inside of IR35, although it is a very, very minor point. Generally speaking, clients and agencies will use timesheeting or self-billing systems as a means of budgetary control over their own finances. They're not intended to be a controlling factor over the contractor. So HMRC don't usually put a lot of stock in that particular point, but the ideal is that the contractor invoices for their services. The actual way that time is billed for the contractor will also have an impact. So what I mean by that is, if the contractor is paid an hourly or daily rate, then that will be more indicative of a contractor being outside of IR35 than if they were paid, say, for example, a weekly or monthly rate. The reasoning there being that a contractor should not ever receive payment for time spent not providing services. So if the contractor is sick, for example, or just doesn't work on a given day, they shouldn't receive payment for those days in particular. If the contractor is on a weekly or monthly rate, then in those situations, there is potential that the contractor might, say, for example, if they were to work 5 days in a given month and still receive £10,000 for that month, then they would also still receive that £10,000 if they were to work 25 days in the month on a monthly rate. Whereas on an hourly or daily rate, there's no way that can happen. The contractor will only get paid for time spent they actually provide the services. The ideal when dealing with the rate of pay and what money the contractor receives is that the contractor is given a fixed fee for the services they're providing. Once the services are completed, I will pay you £10,000. Whether that takes an hour or 3 months, irrelevant. Once you finish the services, I will give you this fixed amount. The reason why that's beneficial is it introduces an element of financial risk, and also it proves that the contractor can benefit from sound management of their business. So, for example, if the contractor says, I reckon that this work will take me 1 month and I want billing £10,000 for it, if the work actually only takes a week, then the contractor will have benefited by sound management of their business, and they can then move on to another contract earlier than anticipated while still getting the full amount of money. Likewise, if the contract overruns, so if the contractor estimated it take a month and it in fact takes half a year, then that contractor is still only getting £10,000, and then they have lost out on the potential to move elsewhere and provide other services. So that particular form of payment, the fixed fee, isn't very common nowadays. Most contracts I see will operate on either an hourly or daily rate, which, as I say, are both perfectly acceptable from an IR35 basis. So, length of engagement. A very, very common misconception with length of engagement is that it has much of a bearing when it comes to IR35. The honest answer is it doesn't, not really. Length of engagement by itself isn't really a factor that HMRC considers for whether or not a contract is inside or outside of IR35. It's the factors that come alongside of it that can cause a problem. So a long contract, like a 3-4 year contract, for example, might introduce factors into the engagement that can suggest that the contractor is part and parcel of the client's organization, or the contractor might start being offered employee type benefits. A very classic one that comes up this time of year is the Christmas party. The contractor may have been there for a 3-year period and may be offered to go on to the client Christmas party with the client paying for it. That shouldn't ever really happen. The contractor should never essentially get the same sort of benefits that a client employee would do. At the end of the day, if the contractor wants to attend the Christmas party, then they should do. But the contractor needs to make sure that they are paying their way for that. And what I mean by that is that they're essentially not getting paid for during the event, and that they are paying for their own ticket to attend. If they do that, then there's no reason they can't attend. So to bring it back to the length of engagement pointer, as long as the contractor keeps firm and fixed barriers between themselves and client employees, then ultimately length of engagement isn't usually considered to be a factor. That being said, the only time that it really is considered to be a factor is when you've got a really, really short contract. So we're talking like week-long contracts, for example. It's very difficult for HMRC to argue that that's employment in that case. Excuse me. Because by the very nature, they're short-term contracts, and the contract flips between multiple clients over a month or 2 months or 3 month period. If the contract was just multiple week-long contracts, but they were for the same end client, then HMRC would most likely just bundle those all into one long engagement and classify it as one contract. Right of termination. Simply put, the contractor should always have the ability to terminate the contract with little to no notice for whatever reason they like. It's not usually considered to be a decisive factor from an IR35 perspective because ultimately an employee, for example, can hand their notice in on a 30-day notice period. But if there is a 0-day notice, that is to say the contractor can basically say, right, I'm done with this, down tools and just walk out on that day, then that's going to be quite positive from a contracting perspective or an IR35 perspective. We normally say that anything up to 30 days is acceptable. Anything past that is still all right from an IR35 perspective, but it's far from ideal because then you start getting to the realms that there's an implication that mutuality obligation is there. So a 3-month notice period, for example, would suggest that the contractor is quite integrated into the client's business and isn't able to just be removed at the drop of a hat like a independent contracting resource should be. So always keep an eye on the notice periods in the contract. Generally speaking, 30 days or less is all right, but the shorter the notice period, the better. So integration. I've touched upon this very briefly a little bit earlier on. Quite simply, a contractor should be seen as being a contractor. If they're seen by the client's employees and the client themselves as being a employee of the company, then HMRC will often look at it that way as well. The expression, what is it? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. The same thing applies to contracting. If it looks like an employee and acts like an employee, then it probably should be an employee. Yeah. As mentioned a little bit earlier on, being part of a team is not indicative of being an employee. It just means that you're having to work as part of a team. The contractor should always be identifiable when on the client site as well. The example I quite often give to contractors who say they don't have like contractor ID badges or anything like that is just get a lanyard with the word contractor written on it. So at a glance, you're visibly distinct from client employees. Or, in an email signature, for example, instead of having your name, have your company name or have consultant or contractor somewhere in there, or even use your own email address if you have the ability to do so. Things like that are all pointers towards the contractor not being integrated in the client's business. HMRC have, for example, in the past, spoken to end clients and spoken to HR departments and said, this person, are they a contractor or are they an employee? And if you're speaking to a faceless HR department, then it's entirely possible that HR department won't know the individual and may just make assumptions. The more that you can get the impression that you are a contractor out there, the more benefit there will be from an IR35 perspective. Although it is important to know that it is still quite a minor test. Bundled in that would be whether or not the contractor has managerial responsibility. Are they responsible for appraisal disciplinaries of client staff? Do they do mentoring, that sort of thing? All of those sort of aspects would suggest that the contractor is quite heavily integrated into the client business and are probably controlled in some way or form, and is never something a contractor should be responsible for. Non-exclusivity. Simply put, it shouldn't be any club of the client's business precisely who the contractor provides services to, so long as it doesn't cause a conflict of interest. the contractor should be able to provide services to anyone they want, regardless of whether or not it's seen for them to have time to be able to do that work. They should always have the capability to engage other clients to pick up work, etc. Because at the end of the day, they could always subcontract the work out. They could always engage a substitute to finish off project A while they move on to project B. All of that sort of, all those sorts of aspects come into play. If the contractor is, or rather I should say, if the client is restricting the contractor's ability to provide services elsewhere, it will imply an employment-like relationship. So it will be seen as being a negative for IR35 purposes. And then rock bottom of the pile when we're dealing with the minor status tests is intention of the parties. This is really, really, really minor, but in the event of a tie break between all the other aspects around IR35, the tiebreaker, that is to say the intention of the parties, will be the deciding factor when it comes to IR35. Oops. There we are. So if the intention of the contract was to create an contractor-to-client relationship, that will be important for IR35, although only in the barest of cases. If the intention, however, was to create one of employer to employee, then that will obviously go against the contractor. It's key to note that you'll see occasionally, or most often, a clause similar to the one that's in front of you there, located in the contract. It's good to have that clause in the contract, but if the reality goes against what that clause is stating, so for example, if the contract says this is intended to be a contract for services between two companies, but if the rest of the contract is indicative of one of employment, then that clause isn't going to count for much at all. So it's very important that the reality reflects what the contract states. When a contractor is speaking to their client and their engager, it's quite important that they should avoid employment terminology. So what I mean by that is quite often a contractor will refer to who engages them as their employer and the person who is their client contact in the business as being their manager. These sorts of terms can lead to problems from an IR35 perspective, especially if the contractor is talking to HMRC about it. So what will happen, for example, is that HMRC will send out a questionnaire at the start of an IR35 inquiry asking a load of questions. And one of those questions may be, who do you report to in the client's business? The contractor might look at that and go, well, I don't really report to anyone, but I know what they mean. So they could say, my manager is so-and-so in so-and-so department. If they do that and send that back to HMRC, then HMRC will say, well, you've just said you've got a manager and that you report to somebody. There's two aspects of control that we can use. What the contractor should do in that situation is say, I don't report to anyone in the client staff, but my client contact is so-and-so. That's much more indicative of a non-employment relationship. So it's very important the contractor is avoiding using terminology that could imply that they are an employee. Office holders. This is another aspect that is quite important from an IR35 perspective that hopefully no one comes across. If the contractor is occupying a position of authority in the client's staff that would ordinarily be posted by, say, an employee, and the position exists before the contractor occupies the role and will exist after the contractor leaves it, then that could be considered to be an office holder. So directors are an example of that. Chief executive officers, things like that are all office holding type positions that can cause problems from an IR35 perspective. If the title is a title in name only, so say, for example, marketing director, and it's just there to effectively impress clients of the client, then it might well be defendable from an IR35 perspective, but it certainly isn't going to be ideal. Always, always, always avoid using director-like titles when you're talking about the contractor's work, because it leads to more questions than it helps. So it's key to note with that even if a contractor is considered to be an office holder, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are inside of IR35. All it means is it will be very difficult for them to be outside of IR35. because they have to be absolutely certain their right of substitution and is absolutely rock solid, and that they're not being controlled by the client. In both instances, there is usually difficulty for an office holder to prove those because of the levels of integration that they're subject to. So now we're on to more or less catching up in recent times, now that we've gone through the key status tests, etc., and how they're looked at. It's important to note that both with the public sector changes and the private sector changes I'll get onto in a minute, that the actual means and methods of assessing whether or not a contractor is inside or outside of IR35 are not changing, and they have not changed. So the key tests, substitution, levels of control, mutuality of obligation, are all going to still be very important aspects when dealing with IR35. It's simply who is responsible for managing it that is changing or has changed in the private public sector in 2017. So the new rules were introduced in the public sector in 2017. So under the current rule set, the contractor, or more accurate, I should say, under the rule set prior to 2017, the contractor is responsible for making their own determination on their IR35 status. After 2017, that changed for the public sector to being the end client. So if the contractor is providing services to a public sector entity, that is to say somebody who is subject to the Freedom of Information Act or its Scottish equivalent, then it becomes the end client who is responsible for making the determination as to whether or not a contractor is inside or outside of IR35. If the end client makes a determination that the contractor is inside of IR35, regardless of how they get to that conclusion, then what they should do then is inform the fee-paying entity, which is the company that's responsible for paying the contractor's company, most often an agency, and then that fee payer will reduce at source, before the contractor even receives the money, the relevant taxes as if they were a PAYE employee. What's left then goes over to the contractor, and the contractor then has to take effectively as a salary. The contractor has pretty much no say in whether or not they are inside or outside of IR35 as per this rule set. There was no ability for the contractor to raise a complaint or appeal the process. The only option the contractor really had was to sort of induce an inquiry against themselves by speaking to HMRC and asking them to investigate their situation. And to be quite frank, no contractor is ever going to invite HMRC to look into their own affairs. But it was essentially the only option a contractor had if they didn't feel like they were being treated fairly. So, as it says there, the rules on how the determinations are made are unchanged. It's all based on the previous criteria that I've just ran through. All the case law, etc., still applies. It's literally just who is responsible for making the determination that's changed. When coming to a conclusion on whether or not a contract is inside or outside of IR35, HMRC largely left it to the public sector body's own determinations. They can make their own choices up as to how they come to that conclusion. HMRC produced a tool called CEST, Check Employment Status for Tax, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's not great, to be quite frank. There's a lot of things in there that HMRC don't flag up on. There's a whole bunch of issues with it. Case in point, HMRC don't even question mutuality of obligation in the CEST tool. So it's not a complete package, but HMRC still push it and say, if you get an outside determination using CEST, then the result can be stood by in the event of an inquiry, as long as the information that went into it is accurate. The problem with that particular statement is the only way of checking that the information that goes into it is accurate would be for HMRC to do an inquiry against you anyway, going right back to square one anyway as to where the contractors were. So it's not a requirement for clients, and this holds true in the private sector, which I'll move on to in a minute. It's not a requirement for HMRC, the clients to use CEST. They can use whatever resource they want, whether that be a third party, an internal process, blanket statements, as much as I dislike those. The client is well within their rights to come to a conclusion however they like. There is no requirement to use CEST. That is a pretty common misconception that a lot of agencies and a lot of clients are going out there and saying that they have to use CEST. Not true at all. When coming to a determination, HMRC require that reasonable care be taken. And this once again holds true with the public sector as well, the private sector as well as the public sector. What reasonable care is, HMRC failed to define, but in essence, what we're looking at when you're dealing with taking reasonable care is making sure that that you as a client or an agency have given it proper thought. If in essence you just blanket statement everybody is being outside of IR35 without any reason for doing so, then HMRC will come down on you like a ton of bricks. In the event that an end client blanket statements everybody outside of IR35, that is to say not caught by the legislation, and HMRC gets wind of that and investigates them, the end client is the one who holds the liability for that error in judgment. If, however, it is proven that the end client has taken reasonable care in making their decision, then the liability for the incorrect determination shifts down the contracting line to the fee-paying agency. It's never the contractor that takes liability for IR35 determinations after, 6th of April 2017, and for the private sector, 6th of April 2020. It's always the end client and the fee-paying agency, or the fee payer themselves if the client has a direct contract with the contractor. Curiously enough, however, HMRC don't really mind end clients and agencies and the such making determinations where they blanket statement everybody inside of IR35. Ultimately, that nets more tax for HMRC. So naturally, HMRC aren't really going to query it because they get more money out of it. But by their own words, blanket statement determination should not be used. So not encouraged at all. Every contractor should have their own engagement checked and sort of vetted, if you like, from an IR35 perspective, independently of each other. Because even though they may be doing a similar job, each contractor's individual circumstances might lead to an outside or inside determination independently. From an agency or client perspective, what you need to be doing is ensuring that you have an audit trail to prove that you've come to an adequate conclusion. So a paper trail, this review has been concluded, these were the results, we asked the contractor this, we checked with the client, that sort of thing. As long as you have some proof to say that you have come to a determination reasonably and you haven't just sort of knee-jerk reactioned, that should suffice for reasonable proof, or taking reasonable care, I should say. The more information you have, the better. So the changes coming in April 2020. So as it currently stands, only the public sector has to manage IR35 in the manner just described. That is to say, end client making determinations, fee payers being the one reducing the fees at source before the contractor even receives it. After April 2020, that then becomes the liability or the responsibility of pretty much every end client in the UK. There is some slight tweaks in how the legislation is being applied. It will only apply to medium or large businesses as defined by the Companies Act. So if the end client is a small business, and it's important to note that it's all based off of the end client, not the agency. If the end client is a small business, then the determinations are still the contractor's responsibility. So this new rule set will not apply where the end client is a small business. It only applies for medium and large businesses, so like your Microsofts, your HSBCs, that sort of thing. Once a determination is reached by the end client, then that determination then is required to be passed down the contractual chain. So if, for example, there is 3 agencies sat between the ultimate end client and the contractor, the ultimate end client would make a determination on the contractor's status. They'd pass it down to agency 1, who'd pass it on to agency 2, then agency 3, and then the contractor themselves. In the public sector, there is currently no requirement for that to happen. So that's actually quite a positive thing that HMRC have introduced in that case. What you'll see is the term status determination statement bandied around quite a bit in relation to that. That's essentially the document that the end client needs to produce or have produced by a third party to say this is the contractor status, and then that moves down the contractual chain. The other thing that's been introduced that I'm not really sure why they bothered, but is that they have now introduced a dispute resolution process. So if the contractor doesn't agree with the determination that's been given to them, the contractor can then argue their case. The problem is that dispute resolution process is headed up by the client who made the determination in the first place. So I suspect that the conversation will go something little on the lines of, I disagree with the determination you give me. I think I'm outside of IR35. The client will go, okay, well, let us review it. No, we still think you're inside. And then that's the end of it. At that point, the contractor then has to go to HMRC again, as they would have to originally, and sort of incite a review against themselves from an IR35 perspective, if they want to get anywhere. So once again, kind of back to square one. So that in a nutshell is the changes that are coming in April 2020. It's just a continuation of the public sector guidelines that are already in place. Another misconception that comes along is that IR35 is being introduced in 2020 or 2017. It's not the case. It has been around for a very long time now. It's just that beforehand, a lot of clients and agencies didn't really have much involvement with it, so they didn't really care about it. Now that it's the end client and agency's responsibilities, suddenly there's a lot of panic around it. So that is the presentation. So now there are, if you've got any questions or queries, now's the time to raise them, and I'll try and go through some with you. So I think we have one. So I do have a question here. Just give me a second to have a read through it, and then I'll answer it. Right, okay. So here's the question, just for your benefit, but I'll read it out as well. As soon as everything catches up with me. So I'm going outside of IR35 pre-April 2020 to an inside of IR35 post-April 6th, the same end client. Should they be concerned? What steps can I take to prove my status up to the 6th of April, i.e. the liability? A very good question in that respect. So HMRC have said that decisions that end clients make post-April 6th, April 2020 will not affect determinations prior to that point. So if, for example, the contractor is operating outside of IR35 up to the 6th of April for a single end client, and then suddenly the end client switches their status to being inside of IR35 on the 7th of April onwards, HMRC have said that they won't hunt people down for that. To be fair, HMRC have, however, said that multiple times in the past and still done it anyway. So the correct thing to do, as you've mentioned, is to do all the relevant checks, etc., to make sure that you are outside of IR35 on the run-up to April 2020. So the sorts of things you can do with that respect is conduct a contract review, an IR35 contract review. You can have a working practices review. You can speak to the client themselves and get their view on things. The important thing is that you make sure that you are clear on your status. Liability-wise, the liability up to the 6th of April will lie with the contractor. After that point, so from the 6th of April onwards, it switches to being the end client and fee payer's responsibility. So it's important that you consider taking out, say, insurances that will protect your liability. And as I say, making sure you've got all that evidence to back up your status for all the periods before the 6th of April. So I don't think we have any more questions at the moment. I'll give it a couple more minutes just in case anyone else wants to pop any questions in. But I think that just about covers off the presentation. Will, if you still have your microphone available, do you want to make any closing comments?
I just actually put a question in there for you. So one of the minor tests was around
yeah, I can see it.
Managing
carry on.
Client staff. Would contractors managing other contractors have any have any bearing on that? Either positive or negative?
So I'll just project the question just so everyone can see it, just in case. So there's the question that's being asked. In essence, yes, the contractor shouldn't ever really have any ability to control either client staff or the contractors. Do note that there is a difference between being a project manager and being a line manager. So again, project management is quite a common thing for contractors to do. That's fine from an IR35 perspective. All of that is doing is ensuring the project is being completed on time and divvying out certain aspects of the work. It's all, well, you would hope that all of the work that is being divvied out is a known quantifiable thing from contractors. So, for example, the contractor who is having the work given to them will know what that work is coming ahead of time. The project manager's role is simply just to make sure the project is completed on time. They're not operating as a line manager would do. If the contractor is responsible for line management of anybody, so client, staff, contractors, that sort of thing, it suggests that the contractor is heavily integrated into the business and that they themselves will be subject to some level of control, because managers always have some aspect of control over them due to client policies, procedures, that sort of thing. So avoid it where possible. Don't ever be a line manager if you're a contractor. Excellent, good stuff. So as I say, essentially you've got our contact information at Larsen Howie there in front of you, info@larsenhowie.co.uk. If you have any more questions and queries off the back of this presentation, that's the best place to send your question. Or you've also got the phone number there. Feel free to phone up and have a chat with the team here. We're more than happy to answer any of the questions you've got. Okay. So as I say, Will, do you want to make any closing remarks? Or
no, I think that's everything from me. Just thanks very much for that, Matt. It's really useful. And yeah, if anyone's got any questions, just feel free to get in touch with any of us.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for all attending. That's the webinar for today. As I say, we'll make sure you will get a copy of the slides, and yeah, do get in touch if you have any questions or queries. All right. Well, thank you very much and have a good day.